Aloha mai kako. My name is Kammie Tavares. I'm a master's student at Manoa, and I work in the Department of Earth Sciences. My advisor is Dr. Chip Fletcher, and today I will be presenting to you my research project. So my project focuses on beach erosion and the effect that might have on Oahu's shoreline when the ocean rises. So I have the privilege to study one of the most beautiful environments in the world, and that is Kahone, which is the Hawaiian word for sandy beach. This is a picture of Makua Beach, which is located in Wai'anae on this island. It's a kahone that is special to my heart because I grew up right down the road and spent a lot of time here. So as I present today, I'd like for you to think of your favorite kahone and what it means to you. So kahone are important for many reasons. They provide a habitat to many native plants and animals, such as the Nopaka kahakai and the Ilio holoika or the Hawaiian monk seal. They are also important to the local culture. Kahone act as an important gathering place for families and friends to relax and enjoy the ocean, the outdoors, and of course the sand. It's also important. It's an important place for cultural practices to take place, such as the landing and departure of Va'a. Kahone is also an attraction to tourists here, and that's important because we have a tourist-based economy. So for all of these reasons, how important this environment is to us, we are its biggest threat, and that is because of walls. So what happens is, again, we love the beach so much, we want to live as close as we can to it, and sometimes literally on the beach. And what happens is kahone are dynamic, so they will move seaward and then they will move inland as they please. And here in height gauges have shown that sea level is rising. So while they move, they're like overall moving inland. And so eventually our beachfront properties begin to experience erosion or the loss of their property. Because it triggers a property owner to want to protect their property and to protect their home. And they do that by applying for permits to build seawalls.
Where's this picture?
Oh yeah, sorry. So this is Head area. I took it during last year's King Tide. Yeah. And it was actually really dangerous to take this picture, like the waves were crashing and there's really no, which kind of supports the point of seawalls being a threat to beaches. So what happens when we put in a seawall? It changes the movement of the sand and the waves. And what it leads to is the narrowing and loss of beach. So this whole taught me the idea of protecting property, but just at the risk of losing the beach, losing property, but protecting the beach. I was really interested in, and I wanted to see what that threat might, or that issue, how it might play out in the sea level rise. So many studies have shown that sea level rise due to climate change, and what we expect from that is that this will accelerate in areas where there are seawalls, and that the length of shoreline that are on the beach, more will be this erosion that sea level rise will cause. It will come with sea level rise. And so that was my project. I looked at this area of threat. So areas sea level rise sorry, let me step back. Okay, so what I'm looking is this issue of where or beachfront development becomes like within the erosion hazard zone. So we expect that this erosion hazard of this threat or this area of threat home walls and start to lose their property, what that might look like in the future. So the way that I do this can be broken down into 3 steps. Is to project the erosion hazard zones into the future. So with 1 foot of sea level rise, where along the shoreline will we see homes be threatened by erosion? And to do that, we look at the historical trend in the area. So whether an area is eroding or if getting smaller, or accreting where the beach is getting bigger. We combine that information with sea level rise projections, and then we can produce an erosion. And then our next step is to identify the current development, so within the roads along the shoreline. And our last step combines the information from the first 2 steps, information we can see the overlap and identify areas that are threatened by coastal erosion. So this is an example of what my method or our methodology looks like. This is Honolulu, which is all beach. It's located on the north shore of Oahu. What we're looking at is an aerial photo of this, and this is in 2015. So what we do is we trace the important beach features. So we trace the vegetation, which is shown in green, and the low water mark, which is shown in blue. So we use the vegetation as our baseline zone, and then we use the low water mark to help us rates of change in that area. So we do this tracing for historical photos that go back century, approximately every decade. And so what we have is a series of shorelines over time, and then transects. This line is an example of one transect. And at that point, we can then calculate the rate of change. So whether that area or creating. Once we have that information, we can put it into our sea level rise model, which then produces erosion hazard zones, which we did an erosion hazard zone for today. And we look at 1, 2, and 3 feet of sea level rise. Once we do that, we can move on to our next step by the beachfront structures. So that includes homes and roads, and you can see that I've outlined them here in black. And then we overlay the 2 layers and identify the overlap in red. So you can see that this area is currently very threatened by beach erosion. So are very likely experiencing property loss and may want to build seawalls in that area. And then with 1 foot of sea level rise, this entire section is threatened by erosion, and the threat continues with 2 and 3 feet of sea level rise, where even non-beachfront homes are. So we did this methodology for the entire, or for all kahōʻone on Oahu. And we're still working on this project. It's ongoing, but I do have some, and this is it. This is a pie chart that shows, or the whole pie represents all of the kahōʻone. Segment is a different segment representing a certain type of threat, or by a threat to coastal erosion. So a few things I want to highlight is that over a quarter of our kahōʻone walls built on them. And what this means is that once that area in front of the wall begins to erode, then and the waves begin to interact with the wall, that beach will narrow and eventually disappear. And we expect that with sea level rise, most, if not all, of these areas that have will see significant beach loss. Another thing is that after 3 feet of sea level rise, nearly half of the shoreline could be hardened or would be threatened by coastal erosion. And that's a significant change. But I think the most interesting thing that we found was that the largest change happens at 1 foot of sea level rise. And we find that this is significant because it really shows us how urgent of a matter this is. A lot of our planning schemes is for 2100, that 3 feet of sea level rise. However, by planning for that, we potentially miss being prepared for the 1 foot of sea level rise that's projected to happen sooner in 2050. And so overall, what we can conclude is that the threat is now. That question of whether to protect property or to protect beach is not going to go away. And in fact, we'll have to ask it and answer it more in the future. So suggestions that we have is that this is going to take community collaboration. And it's not just the state, the city and county, and the land or beachfront landowners, but it's also the community that uses the area, those human and non-human, those living and not living. So it's important that these communities make a decision together on what the shoreline should look like. Which brings me to my last point, that this needs to be a place-based management approach. And what I mean by this is that currently the way that we address the situation is by a property basis. However, that misses the idea that if something happens on one end of the beach, it will affect what happens on the other end. And so it's really a full system that needs to be addressed as the full system. So I will leave with some closing thoughts, and it's an olalo no eo, or a Hawaiian proverb or political saying, and it reads, "E lau hoi mai na va'a, ike ka hoi, ike ka, paiaku ika aina." And it translates into everybody paddle the canoes together, bail and paddle, paddle and bail, and the shore is reached. And this is said in a time that when everybody needs to work together, do their part so that the work is done and done quickly. And I find that this is really appropriate for this situation because we really are in this together and everybody needs to do their part, so that when we paddle our canoe and approach the shore, we ensure that the shoreline is a true reflection of what we value. Will that va'a come upon a seawall or will it come upon a kahone? And that's all I have. Thank you for listening.
She's there. Okay, aloha mai kako. My name is Aka Beebe. I'm a grad student at University of Hawaii Manoa studying oceanography with my advisor, Dr. Rosie Allegado. Currently, I'm in my third year getting my master's, looking at He'eia Fishpond and some of the changes that has to do with mangroves. So let me get started. So fish pond, or the traditional name loko'i'a, they're key food resources in Hawaii. They were managed in a way that utilized the resources of the land and the sea to effectively multiply the bounty that could be had by the residents in the area. It's a unique aquaculture system invented in Hawaii, and I found out that it was looking at all the fish pond area and what the average production of fish pond could be. They're capable of producing 1 million kilograms of fish annually. Yeah, currently the fish pond production is less than 1% of this. So that has a lot to do with historical change, land use, land change. There's a socioeconomic element to it also, and also just the change in the practices on the land, how the land was managed, what type of farming was going on, cattle ranching and such. They found that Hawaii is a unique place in that certain practices could actually hurt this land. So they found that out the hard way, and a lot of the forests were denuded. There was mass erosion from the upland areas, and it flowed down onto our reefs and really wreaked havoc. So back in the day, one of the practices that they took part in was reforestation, which is great because you have to put back what you took out, right? And with all the best intentions, they planted plants that would grow quickly, that would be resilient in the areas that they would grow in. But in hindsight, 2020, we see now that it would have been better to find out what was there before and put those back. Most of the species that they ended up planting for reforestation were not native to Hawaii. They did change the environment to a great extent, and today we still see them around. They threaten our native species. Some of them can even be responsible for altering the hydrological characteristics of the area, so it can threaten our water resources. Whereas the native forest, it's made to be in this tropical setting with not a whole continent behind it feeding in resources. It's just an island in the middle of the ocean. So mangroves was one of these species that they planted in the nearshore areas. Did a great job in catching the sediment, catching the runoff and whatever soil that was washing off of the land. It did a great job in slowing down the flow. But today, now we see that there are some negative effects. And one of those negative effects is that they're very prolific. They're native. The main mangrove species we have here is native to tropical areas, and they grow. And without any competition, they ended up spreading along the coastline, and they took root in many fish ponds in their structures in the wall. In this picture, you can see this is a fish pond on Molokai. You can see the wall over here has been damaged. There's no mangroves on this fish pond, but it's just an example of the state of a lot of fish ponds today. So mangroves, they're ecosystem engineers. They're very robust trees. They can handle the salt. They can handle low oxygen. They can handle being submerged in water. They're amazing plants, and in parts in the world where they're native, they're a true keystone, cornerstone species, and that's because of the effects that it has on the environment. Sorry, it's kind of hard to see it got kind of messed up, the formatting, but these three circles, they represent just different perspectives in looking at our environment. So on the top, we have the chemical. On the bottom left is the physical, and the bottom right is the biological, and they all play hand in hand. And mangrove influences all of these, I guess, realms in the environment. Physically, they slow down water flow. They act as a windbreak. They also have very sturdy prop roots to hold up the land and also capture a lot of sediment. So they end up accumulating a lot of sediment and debris. The chemical aspect of mangroves is how they grow so prolifically, and all of the all of the branches and leaves falling off. They end up sinking into the water, and it creates an anoxic zone. Yeah. And biologically, mangroves, where they're native, they create great shelter for the species there. They're a food source for many native crabs, where they're native in. But here, there's no species that can actually utilize the green waste from mangroves. It's toxic to them. So what happens is it accumulates and then it spills into that chemical aspect where the oxygen in the water gets drawn down. And that anoxic environment, it's not a good place for fish. They need water. Some tilapia or some fish species, they can go up and gulp air, but not all of them can. And it's just another thing that they have to, they have to wrestle with trying to survive in the wild. Whereas in a native shoreline, a native vegetated shoreline, it would have all kinds of different species that could survive there. So circulation and flow, physical, carbon and nutrients, and oh yes, the food web imbalance. That's because the detritus or the everything that falls off the mangroves, the green waste, is not able to be used by most animals in Hawaii. So instead of having something that can utilize it, grow big and fat, and get eaten by a fish, right? You'll have all this stuff accumulating. Then you need another way for that to be utilized. Nothing is wasted in nature. So microbes come in because they have a different tool set and how they can eat and then survive. So it ends up being imbalanced in that your bacterial guys are going to be processing it a lot more than where it would be native to. Okay, so in He'eia Fishpond, restoration has been ongoing since early 2000s. This is a this is a map showing the different times where they've removed mangroves. So it's a sequence of their restoration, removing mangroves. All in the blue here, all the blue shapes, they're along the fish pond wall, the outer wall. On this side is Kammie Bay, and up here is upland. Upland is a marsh that is also being currently restored. This is in the He'eia Ahupua'a in Kaneohe. It receives fresh water from He'eia Stream, which runs along this side. And these white lines along the wall, both on the outer wall and the inner wall, they're makaha, or sluice gates, portals, if you may, where water can be exchanged, water, fish, material. There was a big storm and we saw stuff from the lo'i that washed down into the fish pond. So yeah, it's a place of exchange of not just water, but anything in the water. So with these gates, these portals, they can alter the flow of the water. They can tune it in to get fresh water mix and the ocean salty water mix. Also, this helps to manage what types of fish that they can keep in there and what types of fish that they can keep out. Because this is a food system, they have a target species that they want to produce, which is food for us, hopefully, and if we're lucky enough. So what they want to do is they want to create the habitat for them to thrive. They want to protect them, and they want them to, proliferate. So this is a very interesting system, and I'm lucky to be able to study it. So I'm going to take you through some of the things that I've measured and found out so far. I go out and take measurements of the water, some chemical measurements, also biological measurements, and I do this throughout the fish pond. So I have different points, and this can show us how dynamic, how much change there is in the system, how different one side can be from the other, and how it changes over time. As I said before, the water exchanges on both sides. So even in just the period of one day, there can be a lot of change going on in the fish pond, where the incoming tide can bring in more salt water, and then the outgoing tide, it'll let the fresh water come in easily. So this is one of the variables that I measure is salinity. It's, as I say, and I heard a master variable, because it's a good tracer of what the source of the water is, because it doesn't really get used up or get created. It's either salty from the ocean or fresh from the fresh water. So it's a signal. It's an indicator of where the water has come from or how much of that mix you got in there. So up here on the freshwater side, where these makaha are letting fresh water in, you can see that there's low values of salinity. And along the ocean wall, you can see there's higher values in red. And in the middle, there's a mixture of the salinity. On the left-hand side is measurements taken in 2014. And on the right-hand side were recent measurements that I've taken. And we can see that there's a little bit of difference in there. You kind of got to squint your eyes. But you can see that there's more of an ocean influence relatively than what has been before. Okay, so going on to the next, from the physical, the salinity to the chemical, we have nitrogen. So it's just like a fertilizer. It's what plants need to grow. So nitrogen is a source for nutrients for the plants of the ocean, the phytoplankton, the guys that are making all the food for the system. Phytoplankton and algae. The plankton are the ones that are floating in the water, and they use the dissolved nitrogen. So we can see that the nitrogen has changed also. It's relatively lower in this region of the fish pond. And this can have a lot to do with the restoration also, and it may change even the biology. So, like as I said, the fertilizer is the nutrients for the phytoplankton. So we have some data. I don't have 2 time points in this data, but I have 2 types of phytoplankton. Here we have blue-green bacteria, Synechococcus, and here we have diatoms. So they're both phytoplankton. They're both photosynthesizing like plants, making food out of sun, nutrients, and the air. But the differences are that these are much smaller. These are on the scale of bacteria. So you see this little line down here, it's 1 micron. And whereas on this diatom picture, this little line down here, I know it's hard to see, it says 5 microns. So they're like almost 10 times bigger than these guys. And their diatoms are really diverse. They require a different environment, a different set of nutrients to thrive in the fish pond. They're even influenced by salinity, but they're good because they're big enough for our fish to eat. Yeah. Whereas the blue-green bacteria, they're too small. So instead of having the primary producer get eaten by the fish and we eat the fish, you'll have to have the bacteria getting eaten by something else, getting eaten by something else, then getting eaten by the fish, then getting eaten by us. So it's less efficient. So with that, we're finding that restoration has brought changes to the fish pond environment. Physical and chemical changes will influence biology, and knowledge of relationships will inform the practice undertaken in the fish pond. And what's next? Continue to collect measurements and learn more about the relationships in this environment. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. Mahalo.
Aloha, everyone. I'm Eileen Nalley. I'm a graduate student at the University of Hawaii, and I work out at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. And Aka and Kammie did a great job of kind of setting the stage for what I'll be talking about tonight, which is land-based pollutants in coastal reef fishes. And so an important part of talking about this project, I think, is kind of discussing how I started to get interested in this topic and kind of how the curiosity arose. So for much of my dissertation research, I've been looking at diet specialization in herbivores on coral reefs. So mostly little sturgeon fishes like manini. Are people familiar with manini, kole? Probably find them on some of these things. So they're these small little herbivores that eat little filamentous algae that can be just a few millimeters tall. And in general, everyone says, oh, they're herbivores, and we just kind of leave it at that. So I've been trying to kind of dig into seeing how all these different species can coexist and graze in really heavy numbers in these small areas. And part of how they do that is this is what they're eating. And so it's this small, as I said, kind of short turf algae, but it's lots of different kinds of algae. And it's this fuzz that you might have seen kind of growing on a lot of degraded reefs. It looks almost like a little carpet on rocks or on dead corals. And so it attracts a lot of sediment and kind of captures it. So a lot of these fish, in looking at 1 billion fish guts for this other work, I saw there's a lot of sediment in here. And so even though they're targeting algae, a lot of them are also actually eating a lot of sediment. And some of them, like kole in particular, actually target the sediment. Others, that might not be their main target. They're mainly going after algae, but they eat a lot of it incidentally. And so looking at all of this and knowing that some of these fish can be decades old, which is surprising in and of itself, I started to grow more and more curious about what was in that sediment and how might that be affecting these fish, because these are fish that people eat a lot. And so a lot of the fish are coming from these really impacted areas like Kaka'ako or Honolulu Bay and other places. And so, that kind of started to drive this curiosity about how land-based pollutants might be affecting reef fishes. And in digging around, I found that there really isn't much information on that in Hawaii in particular. In general, there's not a lot of information globally on this topic, but in particular here, we know very little about what land-based pollutants are showing up in these reef fish tissues that people eat all the time. So that's kind of what the driving force behind this work has been. And so I think we're all, especially on Oahu, pretty familiar with a lot of the impacts that we see on our coastal reefs. On the bottom left, you see Sand Island. There's a lot of industrial development, a lot of shipping. On the top right, Waikiki, where we see a lot of urban development, building houses and condos and wildly altered coastal landscapes. On the bottom right, we see another kind of strong impact on our coastal landscapes, which is intensive agriculture. So this is from near Honopepe on Kauai, and we see really, really intensive industrial agriculture right along the coast. And then even in areas that may not be so directly impacted, we still see more indirect impacts, like in the upper right, and on what we like to call more pristine beaches and shorelines, we still see garbage washing up because we're on the fringe of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, as it's been dubbed. And so there's all these different factors that are affecting our shorelines. And so we know that this is happening on land, but how then is this affecting the organisms that live in these coastal environments? And how are they perhaps processing some of these different pollutants and chemicals and whatnot that's washing into these systems? And so there's the slow trickle that happens through streams and just your general day-to-day runoff. But as we've seen in particular in the past few years, there's also extreme storm events which wash massive amounts of sediment and water, and presumably everything in that sediment and water off of land and into our coastal environments, where it settles down. Some of it might make its way out into the ocean, but some of it certainly settles down and is captured in those turf algae that I showed you earlier and settles into the sand and whatnot. And so it's important to get a better idea of how all of this sediment and potential pollutants might be processed through that system. And in particular, another thing that kind of spurred interest and attention was last December, the Department of Health issued a warning about PCBs in goatfish near the Marine Corps base. And so we have these more constant, persistent threats, and then every now and then we're made aware of perhaps some more acute and place-specific threats that could also be affecting the system. So it's important to understand what's happening. And so I've talked broadly about kind of, we would imagine that things that are in the sediment and water and on the land get washed onto the coastal systems. But more specifically, where are all these things coming from? It's one thing to say industrial development, urban development, agriculture, but specifically we're talking about things that are in, well, first let me back up. So for this kind of study that we're doing through Sea Grant, as I said, there's not a lot of pre-existing information on these land-based pollutants in reef fish, so we're kind of trying to build a bit of a baseline understanding of some of this, and we're focusing specifically on metals. And so these are going to be your more industrial urban pollutants. And so those can come from things like cars. The brake pads have copper. I think someone last week talked about that some. We also see it from the military, current and historical use. There's a lot of legacy pollutants that can come from that. We also have a lot of boats, and boats have a lot of copper anti-fouling paint on them, and so that can end up in the harbors. That could be either on small boats, or also we have the larger massive shipping industry. The building industry is certainly contributes to some of these problems, and other pollutants too, not just metals. For example, termites are a big problem here, and tenting houses and applying termite eradication chemicals can certainly have a large effect on the pollutants found in an area. And then also agriculture. So pesticides are one thing. That's not what we're looking at specifically right now. But historically, agriculture used a lot of arsenic to treat fields for sugarcane and whatnot in their pesticides. And so we still see this historic signature of past agriculture in arsenic in some places. And so these are kind of all the different things we're looking for. And I said we're, in this first year, we've been doing a kind of broad stretch, throw a broad net, try and see what's out there. What do we see? So we're looking at 7 different sites on Oahu and 4 on Kauai that we, for various reasons, expect might be experiencing some impacts. And so, for example, we have harbors like Haleiwa Harbor, Waimanalo Gulch near Electric Beach. There's a large landfill, 2 landfills right on the coast, and so we're looking by the outflow pipe. Kaneohe Bay, there's a big stream which flows out of a heavily developed residential area, as well as the Marine Corps base. Sanda Island is very industrial and developed. Kiwalo, Ala Moana are both urban areas that experience a lot of runoff. Kiwalo is actually, or Kaka'ako area has actually been designated by the EPA as what they call a brownfield, which is either known or suspected contaminated sites. And so that's something that the DOH is looking at. If I just said the EPA, I meant the DOH as well, the Department of Health. And so Maunalua Bay is also something probably near and dear to many of your hearts, and a place that a lot of people are looking at the effects in that area of a lot of development and housing in the nearshore area. And then on Kauai, we also looked at areas where they're experiencing significant agriculture, and this isn't just like people planting some food. I'm talking commercial, industrial, seed crop kind of agriculture, as well as historic sugarcane areas. And so we also looked at the harbor, and up in Anini, there's some particular interests from communities in that area. And so in the sense that we're trying to get a basic understanding still at this point of kind of what's happening. And if we do see these pollutants in any of these fish, we have a particular interest in the detritivores that eat the sediment specifically, and on the herbivores that are grazing on the tiny little filamentous turf algae that traps the sediment. But then we're also looking at other fishes that make up other trophic levels. And so scrapers like parrotfish that are scraping up what we call the epilithic algal matrix. They're getting lots of sediment and microorganisms and whatnot. Fish that target invertebrates that are in the sand and detritus. Also fish that'll kind of eat crabs and other things that might be eating sediment. As well as fish that eat other fish, in case we see these signatures bioaccumulating through the food chain. And so it's a funny position to be in, where actually having no results would be the best result, because it means that there are not pollutants in these fish. But by looking at many different levels, or many different trophic levels and many different sites, we're kind of trying to cover the bases and say, okay, well, maybe fish that mostly eat sediment do have it, but other fish don't. Or maybe fish that eat other fish are bioaccumulating some things, but fish that are eating lower on the food chain aren't necessarily going to have some of these things. So we're kind of trying to get a broad understanding at this point of what's going on. And so the next steps and kind of how we're moving forward is that we've gathered a lot of these samples already. So about 15 fish from each of those sites. And we've also gathered sediment samples from all of those places. So trying to understand if we see it in the, well, I should say as well that in all of these different trophic levels, we're really trying to target fish specifically that people eat and that we know people are fishing for. So we're trying to focus kind of our limited resources on that. And so in that vein, we're looking at muscle tissue rather than liver, even though livers may accumulate some of these things at higher levels. In general, people eat the muscle tissue more than the liver. And so we've sent out these samples to be analyzed using inductively coupled mass spectrometry. I'm not a chemist, so I'm not doing it myself. Also, it's something that would be great to build the capacity more for in Hawaii, but currently we don't really have the facilities to do that kind of work. And so they're being sent away to a site that's done, or to a place that's done work for NOAA and other organizations in the past that we know have a really robust system. And so hopefully from those results, when we get them back, we'll be able to kind of zoom in and say, okay, these sites are of particular interest because of what we found. Or actually, most hopefully, there is no pollutants in any of the fish. That's great. But otherwise, we will use information from this first kind of broad sampling of lots of places, lots of different fish, to zoom in on places in the next year where we can sample not only the fish and the sediment, but also the limu, the water, more different kinds of fish, and kind of try and get a better idea of how also invertebrates, things like crabs and whatnot, to get a better idea of, if present, how are these pollutants maybe moving through the system and through the food web. And also work with communities and other state and federal organizations that are interested in kind of partnering to see how this work can be expanded, and perhaps not just metals, but also other things of interest to people. And really try and focus our efforts on things that we know are of interest to people who are fishing and eating from these areas. And so with that, thank you to all of you for being here tonight. Thanks to Sea Grant.
Hey, so we have all the trainees stand up here. You're on the podium. We'll open up the Q&A session again. We have a shorter Q&A session than usual, just because we would like some time at the end of the seminar to provide some feedback to our trainees, okay? Yes, sir.
For the first speaker, what's the estimate for how long is it going to take for the sea to rise, say, 1 foot?
Yeah, so the most recent publications done by the UN, a most likely scenario, so they do it on a probability scale. And I actually don't want to get this wrong. I'm not sure if it's likely or most likely, but it's still likely that 1 foot of sea level rise will happen by 2050 and 3 feet by 2100, so the end of the century.
Yes. Thank you very much. But why were there no diacritical marks on the Kauai place names where you had them on Oahu place names?
For me.
I don't care who went.
Oh, I'm guessing you mean me because I had Kauai. It wasn't intentional.
Hawaii, it is now really, they should be in over the Na and Hanapepe, they should have been over the east. But Oahu, you had all of diacritical marks, but not Kauai.
That was a mistake. I'm sorry. I try hard to put them all in there, but I must have overlooked it when I was making this.
Where you have Le'ahi. And when I was a teenager, we used to go swimming there, but we always called it, and I'm not sure if it's correct, I think we called it Darstu Cromwell Beach. We always went swimming there.
I have a nicer question.
Okay.
Would you just tell us and remind me what PCBs are?
Yeah, polychlorinated biphenyls. Yeah. So those are not currently used, but they live forever. And so they're seen in a lot of things as kind of legacy pollutants.
For the second speaker, I think it's great that they're taking action to get rid of the mangrove trees that are not native. But I noticed when you're talking about in the pond where they were working on the mangrove, removing mangroves, and they have the gates and they control what type of fish come in. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, they control mostly the size. They can do control on the size because the construction of the gate, they have slots. So, larger fish won't be able to get through.
Okay. There are reasons that it seems to be they're kind of messing with nature by controlling what fish come in.
Definitely. Yeah.
What's the reason for it?
Because they're targeting mostly herbivores. So like the fish that graze on limu and the algae and stuff like that. That's because it's more efficient. You get more bang for your buck. You get more food. Whereas like if you have meat eating fish like piscivores, they're a fast fish. They're fast. They're always swimming. They always got to eat. And you lose some of that energy. Is trickling down. From the sun to the phytoplankton to something, and then we're going to eat it somewhere down the line. So where we can make it more efficient, more of a direct line, we get more of the energy effectively. Yeah.
Good question for that. I do. All of that. This question is for you. Kind of a long question because I want to go back to some of the context that you provided. So I know that when a lot of scientists come here for their research, they're coming here as scientists. Oftentimes when there's a question that involves, say, something that expands beyond, their specific study, there's kind of maybe an attitude of, we don't want to get involved beyond our science. But what I appreciate that you brought into the discussion, we've been talking about like nature, is all the different interconnected ways that, that we, people relate to. So going back to your research, right, about about sea waters.
Mm-hmm.
And so where do you see, or, beyond the science, what's the practical or really even the socioeconomic, political, neighborhood ramifications of what you discovered? Because we're seeing that already.
Yeah.
Right? How it says that.
Yeah. It's a good question. So Okay, so there were a few questions I feel there. So what might that look like in the future? It will be expensive, for one. You will either have to pay money to protect land, but you lose something that does have economic value. You lose a beach. The other option would be to help compensate those who live at the beach, and that would be probably, I think the ideal situation is to have a financial compensation. So that could look like a land swap for those who live on the beach, because to leave a beachfront property and know that it's not going to be, you're going to lose money. And so if you're a beachfront landowner, I think there's that idea that they need some kind of compensation. And so I think that might look like some private fund or government funding to assist with that. I think you asked something in the beginning, and I wanted to answer that, but I got lost in your second question.
I mean, I really love the context that you provided, all of it. But, the whole issue itself is it's such a hot button.
Yeah.
Because there's so many people right now on the North Shore saying, oh my gosh, I'm losing my property, I'm losing my home. Even people who've not built seawalls, right? And so, it comes down to money oftentimes. But then, sure, there's their money, and then there's all of our money. There's the beach.
Yeah. Yeah. So overall, will be very expensive. I think any way that we go, whether we decide to protect some land or protect our beaches.
And one more.
Kevin, assuming I would like to build a wall on my beachfront property, I'm not saying I have beachfront property. To whom do I apply for a permit?
So there are two options. You can either apply through the city and county, or you can apply through the state.
What division?
I don't know the specifics. I think Maya could answer that question. But I don't know specific offices. I would think the Department of Planning, but I'm not sure. Yeah, we'll look into it and we can share that. Yeah.